David, we're going to be talking about best practices related to church bylaws and board policies and procedures. But before we get to that, will you share a little bit about yourself and your law firm?
Sure. Tony, thank you for inviting me, and I really look forward to this. I appreciate all that you guys do and your calling and the impact you're having for the kingdom. We hear about it and feel it all the time with our clients. So thanks again for letting me come in here and talk. For me, I would have been a fifth generation pastor, going back to a vicar in England, to the Assemblies of God. And so I was kind of teased on the church pew, and everybody expected me to go on to ministry. And I went to law school at my dad's recommendation, kind of as an in-between college and seminary, and fell in love with the law, but also primarily fell in love with the fact that I had the opportunity to work with churches and ministries. And that was 33 years ago. And believe it or not, I actually have two clients right now that I worked with as a law clerk that have been clients with me this whole journey. And so it's just been an amazing thing.
Well, David, I don't know if you're aware of this, but through the years, we've worked now with nearly 600 churches, and our sense is that poor governance and dysfunctional church boards, it's actually one of the key reasons why churches get stuck. So I'm curious, from your perspective, working with so many churches through the years, do you agree that that's a challenge? And maybe do you have any stories to share that can confirm my suspicions?
Sure. Well, I'm a word picture guy. I think in terms of word pictures, and we're here in Texas. We don't have basements in Texas because we have clay soil, and you got to have a good foundation or you're going to have a bad house, right? Well, in the same way, the church that is the house of the Lord has to have a good foundation. Legally speaking, not theologically speaking, but legally speaking, it's all of the governing documents, articles, bylaws, minutes, board meetings, resolutions, all of those things that allow us to exercise our religious freedoms. And we have to do those correctly, and I always tell folks, they go, why do they call them bylaws? Well, because they're the laws by which you need to operate. And so when you're thinking about your bylaws, it's you have a whole spectrum, and maybe we'll get into fiduciary duties here a bit, but you have a whole spectrum of duties and responsibilities if you're in a leadership position, serving on a board, et cetera, or as a key employee. And one of those fiduciary duties is the duty of obedience to the law. Well, everybody thinks, oh, well, that's statutes and regulations and the IRS. It is all of those things, but it begins with the law of your bylaws. So that's why they're so critically important. A war story, man, I've got so many. It's one of those things. Bylaws are like, it's in people's minds. I think it's a lot like having a will. Something you don't want to think about, and once you get it done, you certainly don't want to read it again. And that's not the philosophy or the strategy that we certainly encourage folks to partake, because it's so critically important. Why? It's important because of the separation of church and state. If we go down to the courthouse and the judge is asking questions about how you do things, they're not allowed to opine, give their opinion about I think water baptism means, blah, blah. They can't do that. What they can do, however, is start with your governing documents. What do your bylaws say, and what did you do? And it begins with that. So I think your question was, why is it important? Well, it's super important if you want to have a good, solid, firm foundation on which you want to build your house.
Well, so with that in mind, what are some of the common mistakes that you see as it relates to church governance?
Well, a lot of it has to do with not a real clear understanding of what it means to be fill in the blank. Okay, what does it mean to be an officer? One of the funny things that it happens all the time, you would laugh. But I'd say, well, who's the secretary of the corporation? Oh, well, it's Helen. She's been my secretary for 30 years. I was like, no. Is she the church secretary? Well, what does that mean? Okay, so there's just not, and I'm not being critical. It's not their world. It shouldn't be their world. But A
Right.
lot of it has to do with what does it mean to be a key employee? What does it mean to be the chief executive, senior pastor? What does it mean to be an officer? And what does it mean to be a director? And then what do you do when you've got somebody that is a key employee? Let's use a senior pastor, a key employee. He's also the president, the chief executive officer, and a director. How does all that work? And so understanding those things and
Mm-hmm.
everybody staying in their lane is critically important. How do you get there? I think you start off with, if you're a baby church, you start off with some training materials and you get everybody to understand what their role is. And I think small churches have a challenge because everybody's doing everything, right? I mean, what do? I wear 7 hats. We're a small church. But as the church grows, you need to have everybody have defined roles and understanding what their job description is. Another problem that folks run into regularly is directors trying to micromanage or be involved in operations. Again, another word picture. If you think of an orchestra, we've all seen orchestras. And what do orchestras have? A director. Now, it so happens in a corporate sense, the board of directors, they are only a director. They all have to come together. We have to have a quorum, and they can act as a group, right? They're a director. They stand up in front of the orchestra and they direct. They give direction. Oh, we ought to bring that up. Oh, bring that down. And oh, here we go. I've never seen a director of an orchestra stop and go into the orchestra and start playing the tuba or playing the violin. They don't do that. But in the church world, it happens all the time, and it creates lots of problems.
Yeah. In fact, David, that is actually one of the biggest mistakes I see in smaller churches is that the board tends to get too involved in the day-to-day ministry decisions. In other words, they don't empower their senior pastor and staff team to actually lead through their strengths and gifts. So are there some things that can be addressed through the bylaws, or maybe it's the board policies and procedures to help kind of clarify the roles of the board compared to the roles of the pastor and the staff team?
Yeah, I think you should have a board governance policy and make it clear, who is what and what their respective roles are. And then sometimes you're going to have overlapping roles. You may have somebody that's an employee, someone else that is a director, and they're on a subcommittee of the board. So how does all that work? And that should the broad framework for that should be contained in the governing document, the bylaws of the church. But just having a kind of a philosophical explanation of how you want to do church is very, very important.
That's right. And related to this, another challenge that I've seen in churches is that pastors or staff members, rather than waiting for the direction of the entire board, start to take direction from individual board members. And that becomes a challenge as well because different board members may have different perspectives on different decisions and different direction that the ministry is going. It's interesting though, the biggest mistake that I see with large churches, it's almost the inverse of that.
It is.
Because I've seen church boards at large churches that are many times too hands off. And related to this, they haven't appropriately engaged in conversations around pastoral succession either. And so because of that, especially when there's leadership transition, when the board hasn't been involved, it really gets very challenging for that continuity of leadership and ministry mission and direction. So what are some of the best practices for boards at larger churches that they need to be considering to try to overcome that challenge?
Yeah, I would say you have to go back to the basic principle of what are the duties of someone that serves as a director on a board, whether it's a big church, medium church, giga church, whatever. Well, everybody that serves on a board has fiduciary duties. And fiduciary duties, in my world, they kind of gets thrown out like a little hand grenade. Well, you watch it. You violated your fiduciary duty. Nobody really understands what that means, but it's a very simple concept. Three core elements of a fiduciary duty: a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, and a duty of obedience. What does that mean? Well, the duty of care is what we call in the law the reasonable man or the reasonable person standard. when somebody, the government, the courts, whatever the situation, they're looking at the actions of an individual director or a board as a group, are going to ask, was that reasonable? Is that what a reasonable person would do in the same or similar circumstances? That's the standard, a reasonable care. Duty of loyalty means I put the interest of the church, if you're serving on a church board, in the same degree of care and concern as I do my own personal stuff. If I don't do that, if I don't go to meetings, I don't care, I don't read, I don't listen, I'm not engaged, then I really shouldn't be on a board, because the duty of loyalty, obedience, and care is that you're going to really focus in on this like it's important. And then finally, the third is obedience. And obedience just means you obey the law. And the law in this context begins with your bylaws. Okay, you obey the law from that all the way up to the latest thing that the Supreme Court says, the latest regulation, or the latest, law in your community, whatever. You agree that I'm going to do. That's how you fulfill your fiduciary duty. So
Yeah.
another thing that we we're in this season of succession, just in the church in general, in Christendom, and so a lot of folks are in a very important time period to help their church or ministry navigate the issue of succession. It's not generally not a fun topic to approach, but it needs to be approached, and by getting those real life outside of the church walls experience, and the board's bringing that, you're getting consultants to help and all that, then you can prayerfully get to the place that you make the decision for the next generation, really.
David, I think one of the challenges, especially, primarily these are pastors and church leaders that are listening into this conversation. And I've seen a number of instances where the staff leadership, the pastor, recognizes we have a problem with our governance model right now, but I don't want to open that can of worms because I just know it's going to lead to all kinds of tension and division in the church. Any encouragement that you would have for pastors that may think they're facing that type of a dynamic and how they engage this type of a conversation?
Well, a lot of encouragement, I think, it would start with, and this would be self-serving, but, getting a professional that can help you. And I wouldn't say it's just a lawyer. I mean, we love working with you guys because we can come together and we're seeing the thing, but from different perspectives. And so you can work together to begin that. I think that a lot of folks make the mistake of trying to make revision of governing documents an event. Okay, lawyer, make them change, send them back to me next Sunday or whatever. Done. It's really more of a process. I mean, it should be a process, and the process begins with, again, another word picture. But I believe that particularly in non-denominational churches, that you should put a calendar reminder at the 31st of December every year while I'm sitting at home recovering from Christmas service. Get your bylaws out, get them out, and read them, and they should be like a mirror. As you read them, you should go, yeah, that's what we did. That reflects who we are. And if you get to something, you're like, we don't really do that, or we used to do that, but this is what we do now. This is the time to make those small and incremental changes so you can get it right. And you should do that regularly, and not more than annually, but annually is a good time to stop and take a look at your bylaws and other policies, procedures, and documents. You may ask yourself, I didn't really feel good about the way the board meetings went this last year. So how can we fix it? So it begins a process, and you begin to work through the process, and then I think you can avoid a lot of the tumult that comes from those events that people aren't prepared for.
All right. Well, any final words of encouragement you'd like to provide, particularly to the senior pastors who are listening today?
Yeah, I wrote down a scripture. Oh, let me grab it. James 3:16, and it's been on my heart recently, just in the course of working with some folks. But it says, "Where there is strife, there is confusion and evil at work. Now, I don't think it means at the workplace, but I'm reading it that way because the truth of it is when there is strife, that leads to confusion and that can lead to evil in the workplace. And the church is where we work. We work in that world. And so I would just encourage folks to not be fearful. It's always good to have somebody to talk to. We always encourage our clients that are CLT client members. We give them our cell phone numbers. Hey, text me, call me. We know most of the problems you're going to have don't happen Monday through Friday. So let us know so we can be a part of what's going on. And then ultimately for us, and what I would wish for everybody that's listening is whether you work with us or somebody else, have peace of mind so that you can do what God's called you to do through the church, because it's never been needed more than it is right now. And we need you. We appreciate you, and we want to be a help.